Today we have two special speakers at 2 p.m. So just after I finish speaking, we will have Professor Jonathan Glaser from William and Mary in the US. And around 2:40 p.m. Paris time, we will have Professor Vladimir Pinedo Zapatl from Sao Paulo University. So with that, right, let me explain first a little bit how each talk works. We will have around 20 minutes of talk. The Q&A will be a little bit shorter, around 15 to 20 minutes. And then we will have a short recess before the next speaker is on to the stage. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker today. Jonathan Glaser is an associate professor of anthropology at William and Mary University in Williamsburg, Virginia, in the US. And he will be speaking about patrimony as inalienability. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for being today with us. And yes, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Bolius, for the very kind introduction. And thank you so much to the UA for this great invitation to be back here. It's a lot of fun for me to be here again and to be getting to start to know the fellows of this year. I'm going to be very brief today. I'm really going to speak maximum for 20 minutes. And I hope that I'll leave time for your questions and comments and for some discussion back and forth. My intention today is simply to tell you how I came to the topic I'm working on this month, this question of patrimony as inalienability, and what is new for me in this approach that I'm taking during this day. So I've been engaged with the question of patrimony for some time. I first started to think about this in relation to my first book, which was about a long-lasting movement of musical revival in Algeria that began at the beginning of the 20th century. So Patrimony, or in Arabic, Tura, caught my attention early on in that project because it's a ubiquitous concept, right? It's kind of everywhere. I turned and members of the musical community used it to describe this object of their devotion, right? This musical repertoire. So to say that Andalusian music is a national and regional patrimony is in some ways quite simply to say that it's a precious and fragile inheritance that must be protected and then in turn transmitted. So for those of you who are familiar with patrimonial discourse in other Romance language contexts, in a sense, patrimony goes without saying, right? So it's in some ways a rather banal concept for those who are familiar with it. But in making it strange and approaching patrimony with some fresh eyes, I found that it had some very interesting qualities in the context I was writing about in my first book. So discussion of Andalusian music as patrimony is rife with anxiety about varied threats to its integrity. And among them is the claim that master musicians hoarded their musical knowledge, leading to the loss of a great deal of the repertoire. And that's alluded to in this kind of multivalent title of the book. Yet, in spite of 100 years of this movement of revival, through various channels, print, recordings, transcriptions, amateur associations, the various kinds of archive building, the claim of hoarding and of lost repertoire and of general danger is still very strong. So a guide for me in thinking through this question of patrimony in the first project was the anthropologist Annette Weiner. So even though Annette Weiner wrote her work on inalienable possessions based on work she'd done in the Trobriand Islands in Papua New Guinea, it seemed to match up very beautifully with the sorts of questions that I was asking in my project and that I was encountering in that field of study. So Weiner thought that the emphasis in some classic anthropological discussions of exchange on the principle of reciprocity, so this emphasis on reciprocity as a kind of motor of the social, obscured some deeper, she thought, more significant efforts for people to keep precious objects from alienation. So that's where this term inalienable possessions or inalienability comes from in her framework. And these objects that become kept, right, come to stand for an inviolable subject, either an individual subject or more often a collective. And in the Andalusi musical case that I was interested in, the paradox I was seeing was that it stemmed from a tension here between a sense of the nation as caretaker of the inalienable possession and a competing but very resilient notion of musical knowledge as embodied in genealogically embedded masters and disciples. So the question in that context becomes how to bring such embodied knowledge into the public sphere without undermining the very basis of that thing, right? Now, I subsequently turned to other questions stemming from this work. During my fellowship here in 2019-2020, I began a second book that looked at the question of Muslim-Jewish intimacy around music in Algeria, a vexed matter that I'd really danced around in that first book. So during my current sabbatical, I am trying to finish that manuscript. In fact, I am finishing that manuscript. And I've also been working on several offshoot projects, including a digitization project involving some 17th century Judeo-Arabic materials, and a research article about contemporary debates about the border between Judeo-Arabic and Arabic. Now, another fruit of my time here has been a reading spree in some new domains. Thank you, Sadi. You'll recognize one of these, at least, including psychoanalytic and psychoanalytic anthropology, and particularly in the nexus between biological and social thought. Although this reading list might sound very remote from my current writing projects, in fact, they've been very closely connected, and I'm actually planning a future book project that treats the fate of the concept of evolution in anthropological theory. Now, my time at the IEA also allowed me to return to the question of patrimony as it manifested in other domains in colonial Algeria beyond music. And this work led to the fall 2020 publication of an article about the construction of Hispano-Moresque patrimonial collections in colonial Algeria in the middle of the 19th century on the basis of a long period, decades-long period of conquest and of looting by colonial authorities. Now, I was particularly interested in the ironies and alleged continuities between patrimony and the Islamic institution of charitable endowments, sometimes known as waqf, W-A-Q-F, transcribed into English. Even in the midst of their dismantling of the system of waqf, some French officials perceived patrimony as a sort of continuation of its spirit. And this led me to an extended comparison in this article between the concept of patrimony in this sort of museum collection space and the waqf through the lens of Annette Weiner's work on inalienable possessions. So despite the many differences between patrimony and waqf, I argued in this article that Weiner's framework could help make sense of them both. But these examples in turn stretch Weiner's work and brings it, in the process of stretching it, into closer dialogue with some more classic anthropological emphasis on reciprocity as embodied in gift exchange. So here, inalienable possessions do not give the lie to the notion of reciprocity. It doesn't undermine or work against reciprocity, but instead can be read as a form of reciprocity across generations, forms of gifting and of lending that, because of their temporal stretch, involve the passing along of obligation from generation to generation. This allowed me to draw out much more explicitly certain ideas I touched on in my first book, but that I had not really had the chance to theorize. I wanted to return to these questions further and to widen them a bit beyond the particular case that had been the focus of this particular article. But I also wanted these cases to stay close to one another. I thought that it's important to stay within this North African space. So I decided that I should start thinking comparatively about patrimony in several different domains in the Algerian context since the 19th century, right? So in other words, bring together this work on kind of colonial patrimonial collections and looting with my work on mainly 20th century musical practice, and perhaps also some other domains, right? So I've also touched on in certain presentations on ritual aspects, practices around marriages and circumcisions, and even the place of revolution in more contemporary Algerian political life, kind of the memory of revolution as a resource and as a site of struggle. But I keep on coming back to this work I had done on musical communities in this question of hoarding and lostness that I knew so well from my first book. So the challenge here, and I'm trying to think through right now while I'm here at the IAS, is to think comparatively and also connectively about colonial patrimonial collections, in the Algerian context in the 19th century, and musical scenes from the late 19th century onward. So can my rereading of inalienable possessions in terms of cross-generational reciprocity and obligation work for talking across these different domains with their very different modes of materiality attached to them? And what would these cases do to thinking about patrimony as inalienability? Right, so those are some of the big questions I'm trying to bring together during my time here. So in trying to do this, right, I've been excited to engage with the late anthropologist David Graeber's 2011 book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years. Some of you might be familiar with this book already. For those of you who are not, I can just say that it's a rich and big and very messy book. And on its face, it's quite far from Weiner and from the literature she was critiquing, right? This classic kind of Maussian literature. So Graeber, for example, has very little to say about Marcel Mauss, right? A foundational figure thinking about gift exchange and exchange more broadly. Or for that matter, he has very little to say about Bourdieu or even about Marx, who gets very short shrift in this very big book. And on its face, Graeber's position doesn't bode well for my approach that I've tried out in the previous version of the article. So Graeber thinks that classic exchange theory tends to describe some very basic aspects of human existence, and that someone committed to seeing reciprocity at work will be able to find it anywhere they choose. All right, that it's in some ways an overly stretchy concept. Debt, however, in Graeber's reading, is far more specific than the sort of diffuse mutuality that he's associating with reciprocity. So for Graeber, debt presupposes the ability to name exactly how much is owed and the ability to enforce payment. And debt, according to Graeber, is often transferable. So much of his book is devoted to tracing how such ideas and institutions came to be and their close linkage to money, war, interest, and the ability to extract things and people from one context and bring them into another. So Graeber's, I'd say, kind of wild ride opens up many different questions. And I think it's an amazing resource with regard to the multidisciplinary literature on debt. For example, in revisiting the cases I've written about so far, I'm struck all the more by the very strong contrast between patrimony and the market. So whether we're talking about museums of national treasures that originated in theft, the institution of wealth, or musical knowledge, there is a commitment to non-exchangeability and a sort of clinging to and building up of context against decontextualizing forces. And at the same time, it seems to me that here again, there's a great deal about the argument in question that can be translated into a less caricatured dialogue with the classic literature on exchange. So again, as is in the case of my gentle critique of Weiner, I find that Graeber's work tends to cut off his argument from this more classical literature. So Graeber's work, for example, tends to give gift exchange theory short shrift, and the same can be said regarding his treatment of classic accounts of credit and capitalism. And empirically speaking, my reading of the Algerian scene so far and in the wider Maghreb suggests that there's a great deal of overlap between patrimony as inalienability, the notion of the state as guarantor of debt, the guilt and ambivalence that attaches to the project of transmission, and the problem of interest over time, right? So my hope during the rest of my time here is to revisit and widen my reading of this literature and to use my work on patrimonial practices in Algeria and in North Africa more broadly to think through these fundamental questions about exchange, relationality, subject and object, and orientations to past and future. So these are, with reason, some very long-standing questions in social thought. And I'll end by simply saying that I think we still have a great deal to learn about them. And I was exactly 15 minutes. So it leaves time for your questions and your comments and conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful, indeed, 15 minutes. Thank you. Great. So we have, yes, sometimes for questions, you can either raise your hand with the function or unmute yourself or write in the chat if you prefer. Yes, Sadi?
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And as we expected, you're dealing with like massive questions in social science and social exchange theory. So this notion of the starting with the waqf, then this donation, which has an aspect of endowment in a way, you're tackling the issue of a very specific type of transaction, which is transaction about something that is a non-destructive, non-rival good in a way, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that here you're touching, if you're looking at what is given in exchange, I mean, a transaction is you're giving some kind of resource and you're getting something in exchange. Here, what is the motive? It's not trying to do something right now. This is precisely contributing to the patrimony and some kind of immortality, right? So it's not between one person and another and two agents. It's between one person and oneself, like contributing to a culture. So I was wondering if you can actually have a generic theory of social exchange beyond the theory of transaction, and maybe it's quite different to see what are instrumental transactions for getting resources for some activity, or if you are dealing with contributing to participating in a common task. And I think that's a very important question if we want to see how people want to contribute to more generic thing like social progress or sustainability or something like that. So in one way, you have something that's really instrumental, and that's what economics looks at usually. But here you're looking at something that has another dimension, which is collective. It's not just my interest. It's indeed I get something, but I'm also participating. And I think the logic of participation is different from the logic of instrumental exchange.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, that's a fascinating point. So one of the things that I found, first of all, the literature on waqf is tremendous. It's also with a few exceptions very quite atheoretical. I've really benefited a lot from actually interacting with the anthropologist Nada Mumtaz, who's doing very interesting work about waqf in Lebanon. And one of the things that's exciting in having some conversations about this is that, you're precisely right that it's in some respects raises this question of like, well, what's happening here? What's going on in like the bigger scheme of things? And one of the things that strikes me in the case of waqf, but also in other cases of kind of patrimonial practice, is the future orientation, of course, and also this sort of like extension of the subject, or a sort of kind of attempt to kind of throw it into the future. And of course, there's an element of the name, like of the fame of the person, perhaps, but much of the logic that I tend to see in waqf, and of course, there's different schools of Islamic legal thought that treat waqf a little bit differently, but much of them have in common this idea that, okay, there's a sort of speech act that's thrown out into the world, right, into the future, and then there's this kind of picking up of that. It's an invitation, right, for people in the future, right, to take that on, to pick it up and to engage it and maintain it, right? And so that's an element of passing it forward, right, into the future. But it's also about maintenance, right? So there has to be maintaining of whatever that thing is, which could be like a room like this, or it could be texts, right, that can't leave a library or a mosque. It could be a fountain, right, with water. So there's all these sorts of different questions about maintenance that get brought forward with waqf. And of course, there's also these concatenations of what's being brought forward. So for me, and this does speak a little bit to some of my reading that's really at this kind of nexus, or the kind of dialogue between biologists and social thinkers, which has to do with this question of, well, is a sort of creation of a context, right, into the future. And then of course that is a question also of keeping those things close, right? So say you have this space that gets brought forward, there's this intention to bring it forward, and there's this cooperation of future people who are not accessible to me, the originator of the waqf, right? But we're cooperating in the maintaining of the space. That itself is, in fact, maintaining and building and accumulating context. That's a little bit of where I'm. And
sorry, Paulus, if you let me continue on this, it's what's interesting here is this collective aspect, right? Like if you look at social exchange theory or the classic psychosocial triangle, like ego, alter, and the object, okay? It is a very individualistic perspective.
Absolutely.
And that's what economists have in mind. But here, this is not ego and alter, this is more ego and us. So the question is, which group do we participate into? And indeed, this creates obligations to the community in the future to maintain, etc. But this is a gift done as participation and not a gift done personally. So in a way, it's much more like the potlatch. You're getting status in a way, but you discuss with the community, not with one other specific agent where you have, an instrumental transaction. And I think it's psychologically a very different perspective to do something in the purpose of participation rather than in the purpose of one's own interest.
Yep, that's fascinating. Yeah. Yes. That's great. Yeah. And I'll just, one little other note here is that it brings up a very interesting question about the state, right? So we often, endowments in many cases would be made, in fact, against the state, right? In the sense that is a way of keeping the state from expropriating property, right? But then you also have a very interesting pattern, which we see very, very clearly in Ottoman Algeria, for example, where you have who are the people who are often making endowments? In fact, it's people from the ruling family, right? So, and so there's a very interesting question about these layers kind of between, and this is a classic discussion of literature, which is family, state, and then this very interesting space that's being made, in fact, through Mauss. I think I saw Angelo's hand up.
Yes, someone had their hand up. Torre, yes. Is that Angelo?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, thank you, Jonathan, for your speech, which is very, very, very interesting, and it reminds to me a huge panoply of Catholic institutions and charity institutions, which are, I mean, based on the subtraction to the exchange of a certain number of items that we can call patrimony, of course. So the parallel between Waqf and a number of a very important number of Catholic institutions, I'm referring to benefices and to chaplaincies, and also to parish churches, which are subtracted. They are gifts to the future, as you say, and they are, I mean, subtracted to the exchange for the future generation, and they constitute effectively patrimonies. So that's, I think it's a line of thinking very much important, and so but I hope we can speak about later.
Absolutely. Okay. That sounds great. Yeah, and I'd love to learn more about that and about that literature.
Great. Any other questions? Yes. Patty?
Perhaps introduce yourself so we know. Like Angela Torres' question was from yes, Patricia.
Yes. So Patricia has a question, and the question has to do a little bit with the conceptual choice of terms, and why you're speaking here about patrimony in particular and inalienability. So I take that, I mean, that which is inalienable is not only something that you cannot sell, but it's also something that you cannot give. And I'm wondering here, how can it, be a gift to the future if it cannot be given? And on the other hand, there's something in the notion of patrimony that I'm a little bit curious about, that I understand that this monio has also to do with munus, and the munus is a service, but it is also, it's a burden, it's a duty, it's an obligation. So one possible question there could be, would it be envisionable to think of this as not a gift or something that has a kind of property that transcends diachronically in time, but that is, so to say, it is an obligation conferred into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So the conceptual term, you said why patrimony, I didn't quite catch the versus.
So patrimony has the monio, it's patrimonio.
Oh, yeah, I got that.
Yeah, and that monio has to do with the munus, which is a service, a duty, an obligation. Right?
Okay, that's fine. Good. So the thank you very much. That's very so. Certainly the idiom of patrimony is precisely kind of the giving. Is precisely like this transfer between generations, and that's so certainly there's this thing about not being able to sell, but the dynamic that Weiner is talking about, and that I and some others who have worked with her work are trying to get at, is this sense, there's precisely this sort of casting of image, or at least the idea of giving transgenerationally. But this introduces like this interesting problem, which is that in classic kind of Maussian exchange, there is an obligation to give back to the giver, right? So there's an obligation to give, to receive, and then to repay. And what happens if we slow all of that down slowly enough, then the person, the actual giver, is no longer there to give it back to, right? So that's like the temporal dimension that I think is very interesting here. And that introduces this question of burden and also the kind of impossible dimensions of it. And that's something that I was seeing kind of ethnographically in my first project. It was, like this kind of, in fact, kind of anxiety and sometimes despair about being able to pass along the thing, right? And so, and is the thing, particularly when it's somewhat intangible, is it the right thing that's being passed along? So so that obligation side of things, I actually think that's absolutely central. Like I hadn't thought about the kind of etymological side of this, which is fascinating. I would also say that patrimony, I'm deliberately not using the word heritage, right? In the Anglo-Saxon world, like we use heritage a lot, and patrimony is like kind of a weird word. But in places where there's a Romance language as the main language or one of the languages, patrimony has a really different feel. There's something distinctive about it. And it also tends to be a word that can work as a count noun and as an abstract noun, right? So you can have a patrimony, you can have patrimony. And I have an image here that, anyway, we see it all over the place in France, right? Like I think, it's this ubiquitous term, and it does carry a somewhat distinct weight, right? Yeah.
Great.
If I can add again something to what Patricia Mindes said, the fact that you give to your own community or your own lineage is to change something about the reciprocity. It's like you are committing the receiver to give back to the community and not to yourself. You're not there anymore, but it's like you're creating a commitment to the whatever organization you're giving to, for all the people who come after you and who have the benefit of this. So they're repaying that to your family, if it's in your lineage, or to your organization, or to your religion, or to your city, or your country, or your whatever school of thought. And in a way, in doing this, you prolong yourself. In the community to which you give, right? And that's why you get immortality in a way when you do some patrimony, because you are still there through the thing that you gave to, right? You will receive back.
Right. That's the hope, right? The flip side of this is that, of course, nothing lasts forever, right? Like right. So in fact, the question of in the colonial period in Algeria, there was a kind of a dismemberment of wealth. But even aside from the colonial situation, there's always the question of what really happens, right, at the end of this thing's lifetime, right? Perhaps, or the end of people's memory of this, right? Like and that's, I think that's also a very important part of the dynamics I'm trying to compare here, which is that, I think that some of those elements of anxiety that I'm detecting are really about some of the impossible, perhaps utopian aspects of the promise of patrimony, right? That's a very interesting part of this, and I think it's important to think about like the kind of ideal, right? The patrimonial ideal, and then certain realities and what happens when those meet, right?
Could I quickly ask a question? This is Colette Colligan, and I've forgotten how to put up.
Yes,
Sorry.
of course.
I just had two comments. One follows, I think, what you were just saying, which is I was struck at the beginning of your talk when you were talking about the feelings associated with patrimony, anxiety and loss and so forth. So I thought that in thinking through this idea of intergenerational obligation and exchange, that the discourse of feelings for creating a sense of obligation and bonds is something to pursue, positive feelings and negative feelings. And then I was also thinking that it would possibly be useful for you to think about the ways in which intergenerational patrimony is not only built up, but also when it breaks down. And so I'm thinking of, say, for instance, the crisis that English departments are experiencing in terms of teaching British literature or American literature in its historical traditions. And that's an example of a feeling of patrimony really being undone. And so potentially that's a useful line of thinking for you as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, no, thank you. It's good to hear your voice, Colette.
Hello.
Yes, I think yeah, and so the one thing I'll mention about these kind of positive feelings, negative feelings, I think there's also a critique of patrimony, a kind of critique of heritage, which says, well, either kind of critiques it on kind of constructivist kind of grounds, or that critiques it also for its sort of conservatism, often political conservatism. And I have to say that my experience with hanging out with people who really, really talk about patrimony a lot is that there is a lot of interesting forms of critique that enter into patrimonial discourse, both critique of the concept, but also critique often of the state, right? And also dissension, like it's a site of struggle. It's like I often think about the idea of a tradition, right? Where tradition means that you're arguing about, what should be happening, how this should work. And I think that's a big part of the picture, right? There's negative, there's positive feelings, but then there's also a lot of ambivalence, right? Which is actually, its own thing, right? Yeah.
Wonderful. That's all the time we have
Sure.
for the first talk. So thank you so much,
Thank you very much
Jonathan, for joining us.